Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience, although we won't be doing a question and answer period at the end of this webinar. However, the folks at Palo Alto Networks will be getting a copy of all of the questions that do come in. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline following today's webinar. And also at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 6 big lucky winners. All right, let's go ahead and dive into our webinar now. The title is The Ever-Evolving Trendlines in Cloud Native Security 2020. Our speakers today are Keith Mokris, who is Head of Product Marketing at Prisma Cloud, and Matt Chiodi, who is the CSO Public Cloud at Palo Alto Networks. Keith, I know you have got a great webinar on tap, lots of great stuff in your presentation, and I'm going to put myself on mute and let you guys get right to it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Ever-Evolving Trendlines in Cloud Native Security 2020. Thank you so much for everyone who's attending live and on demand. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Matt Chiodi. Matt Chiodi is the Chief Security Officer of Public Cloud at Palo Alto Networks. Matt spent the last 8 years of his career focused exclusively on public cloud security, working for some of the most well-respected companies in the Fortune 500. Prior to joining Palo Alto Networks by way of the RedLock acquisition, Matt was the global head of cloud security at Cognizant Technology Solutions with more than 260,000 associates worldwide. Matt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, this is awesome. I'm really excited to chat today, Keith.
Great, we're thrilled to have you. I'm head of product marketing for Prisma Cloud, and today what we're going to focus on are takeaways from our 2020 Cloud Native Security Report. Over the last several months, Palo Alto Networks gathered data from 3,000 professionals focused in 5 countries, and we interviewed cloud architects, InfoSec leaders, DevOps engineers, and application development engineers. And all of the respondents primarily worked in 5 industries: financial services and insurance, consumer and industrial products, energy, technology and media, and healthcare. Everyone who attends today's webinar will be able to access both our interactive landing page and the report itself. And today what we want to do are drive everyone who's attended through insights stemming from this report. And then Matt can provide insights as he works with many practitioners in this space. There are 3 key sections of the report that we'll be diving into today. The first is the state of cloud and cloud native adoption. How are today's enterprises and organizations moving to the cloud and ultimately, lifting and shifting their applications or architecting their applications? Then, stemming from cloud native adoption, what is the state of security of the cloud and for cloud native workloads? And then finally, we built a metric that we asked organizations about, which is what we call security preparedness. And we're going to share details about how prepared organizations feel for securing their cloud environments. Without further ado, we're going to dive into section 1, the state of cloud and cloud native adoption. First and foremost, cloud is really positioned to become the dominant computing model over the next 24 months. And I don't think this should really surprise anyone in the audience. If you follow data from the CNCF, other infrastructure platforms, you definitely know that organizations are moving to the cloud to ultimately deliver software faster than ever before, achieve greater agility, and achieve greater scale. And so in our survey, 46% of organizations say that their workloads are in the cloud today, and they expect to get to 64% in the next 24 months. And obviously these results may differ from some of the others you may see in the space because we focused on organizations from 5 specific countries and a handful of specific industries. But this really sets a strong benchmark for how organizations are adopting and moving to the cloud. At the same time, we are definitely in a multi-cloud world. And I look forward in a couple of slides to asking Matt some questions about how he sees organizations embracing multi-cloud. And so organizations said that today, 94% of orgs are using more than one cloud service provider platform. And I think this makes a lot of sense as organizations have a distributed mechanism as they move to the cloud. And more importantly, 60% specifically said that they use between 2 and 5 platforms. And so they have workloads and resources spread across a lot of different environments, which would certainly impact not only their application architectures, but also their approach to security, which we'll be highlighting today. At the same time, on top of this multi-cloud world, we are also in what we call a multi-compute world. And so 86% of companies expect their usage of these different compute stacks to increase or stay the same over the next 2 years. Obviously, as cloud adoption grows, you're going to use more of these different stacks to power your applications. And so obviously, if you look at any of the major cloud service providers, they provide many different offerings for organizations today. And you can see here that there's a pretty even distribution of how organizations and how engineers are choosing to run their applications in the cloud. We have virtual machines, which should be pretty familiar to everyone in the audience, as virtualization technology has been a mainstay of building and deploying applications, for well over a decade at this point. Containers refer to the ability to run several containers on their own stack. So platforms like Amazon ECS, for example. And then containers as a service really encompasses the managed Kubernetes offerings that a lot of the CSPs and other platform players are offering today. And so it's not surprising to see containers and containers as a service, if you were to combine these two, would be almost 50% of the expected increase or use by organizations. And then finally, we used platform as a service to encompass 2 key areas of technology. One are serverless function platforms like AWS Lambda, for example, which is certainly leading when it comes to kind of the function platform. If you've gone to AWS reInvent, you know that every year new announcements around AWS Lambda are certainly something that everyone's following closely. At the same time, there are also other platforms like AWS Fargate, Google Cloud Run, and Microsoft ACI, where you're running a code snippet or a container image or a task definition in a very event-driven way. And so we use this PaaS category to kind of encompass serverless or on-demand container usage. And then finally, before we kick it over to Matt for some questions, one of the things that customers expect in the cloud is a continual evolution of these architectures and offerings. And so almost 80% of respondents say their company's cloud infrastructure is constantly evolving. This can be due to different technologies they're using across their pipelines for CI/CD, and it can certainly be how they're actually building, deploying, and running these applications across all of these different stacks we've just highlighted. And here I have some questions for our Chief Security Officer, and we'll start at the top. Matt, are you surprised to see organizations so committed to multi-cloud deployments?
I'm not surprised, but probably not for some of the reasons that you might think, right? So many companies actually go down this route unintentionally, right? So when companies are in the early stages of their cloud journey, a lot of time they don't have a formal strategy yet. So they're out literally trying everything. Let me try this cloud, let me try this technology. But then as companies mature, maybe in the middle of their journey, they kind of pull back and then they usually focus on one provider. I've seen this happen time and time again over the last decade, right? Now, in the latter stages, and our data actually confirms this, then they strategically adopt multi-cloud. So, but for most of the time, most people, however, it depends where they are in their journey. It's kind of the default. It's not part of a strategic plan. And what's funny, it's interesting, Keith, on the previous slide, when we were looking at kind of the breakdown of how companies are using the various different compute form factors, I bet if we had this data from a year ago, I'm guaranteeing that VM number would be significantly higher, right? Just as I guess, we do this again in 2021, that VM number is probably going to be significantly lower, with containers and the like really, really taking up a massive portion of it.
That's a really good insight. I'm definitely excited when we go back and do this survey year over year to start comparing the results. I'd be curious if you feel like some of the strategy organizations have, as they're trying to build their long-term strategy, is that why they're embracing so many different compute offerings? How do you of rationalize that distribution?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, for some of the reasons that companies strategically adopt multi-cloud as they mature, there's one major difference with, I think, the multiple different compute form factors. And that is what I would refer to as application variance, right? So let me explain what I mean by that, right? So in a traditional data center, you really only had bare metal and VMs. And you didn't have, all these different options that you have in the public cloud. So unlike legacy data centers, public cloud allows for any form factor. So it doesn't matter, right? So we know that, from looking at the data, that maybe the first 5 to 7 years of the move to cloud was, for a lot of organizations, really characterized by lift and shift, right? And that's where we traditionally saw a lot of the VMs running that were in the cloud, right? In the early days, it was all focused around infrastructure as a service. And then that really started to change, I'd say, over the last 3 to 5 years. And that's where we really started to see the uptake with containers. So I think, that application variance, the part that cloud just supports so well, I think that's why we see that distribution. And I'm highly certain that even, a year or 2 years from now, there's always going to be some VM component that's in there. And that really gets to the heart why it's so important that organizations, that when they're coming up with a cloud security strategy, that they are very focused not just on one of those, but across all of those form factors. Because how you manage risk is different for each one of those form factors.
I completely agree. And we obviously have, that's a great teaser for the security discussion we're going to have in a couple of minutes. I'd be curious if you were to specifically highlight, as you work with security leaders at organizations, how do they describe this constantly evolving infrastructure and architectures that they have to deal with? Are they essentially in kind of a reactionary mode, or do you feel like they're embedded in all of these new processes and workflows that they have to secure and look at?
I think we'll, without kind of stealing some of the thunder from our data later in this presentation, when we talk about security preparedness, I would say that I feel like we're just starting to get to this tipping point in the security industry, specifically cloud security, where organizations are starting to be more proactive. But I would say that most of the conversations that I've had over the last, let's say, 2 years is typically reactive, right? And, the challenge that I see most organizations dealing with when it comes to that constantly evolving infrastructure is staying ahead of the risk curve. And what I mean by that, right, is just that the rate of innovation in the cloud is so much greater than it ever was in an on-premise environment. And this means then that these new risk vectors are also being created at an equally fast pace. And so in my view, there's really only 2 ways that organizations can stay ahead of this, right? And number one is it's security standards and it's governance, and it's having those 2 things automated in a comprehensive platform. That's really the only way you can stay ahead of it, right? Is standards and governance. I mean, they sound, so many people are just, sounds really boring. And the truth of it is, it's those things that are putting those in place that really allow organizations to stay ahead of this risk curve that's happening with this high pace of innovation.
All right, I'm excited to dive into this even deeper in a couple of minutes because I think the audience, this is something that's right up their alley and how they approach this in a comprehensive way. And so I think this is a good time for us to highlight some of the cloud security and cloud workload security stats, and then dive into some more follow-up coming out of that. So here we want to highlight what is the state of security in the cloud coming out of the 2020 report data that we have. These are the top 3 challenges that organizations shared that they face when it comes to moving workloads to the cloud. So certainly there's a technical complexity, whether you're adopting a lift and shift mantra or re-architecting applications, there are going to be some technical challenges that you need to solve, and that was one of the top responses that organizations shared. As Matt highlighted, comprehensive security is concern number 2. How do I ensure that I've essentially adopted a good risk model and I can essentially implement the right tooling, processes, and procedures to address risk in the cloud? And then finally, just because you've moved your workloads to the cloud doesn't mean compliance goes away. Whether it's an internal compliance regime specific to your organization or an external framework, of which there are many, ensuring compliance, whether it's for a specific workload or app, or for your organization as a whole, is definitely a top concern. And so we'll be talking more about these top 3 in a couple of minutes. One of the things that we asked organizations was, what is your top cloud security concern? And the key takeaway here is that security teams aren't concerned with a single issue. One concern didn't dominate the rankings. Security teams have a lot of different security requirements, and ultimately they all prioritize them differently. And you can see here that the delta from data exposure, malware, and application vulnerabilities down to some of the other security issues listed here isn't that wide. And I think if you asked each organization individually, you'd get a different stack ranked list of these responses. And so ultimately, one of the key concerns that organizations need to look at is how do they essentially prioritize this list and focus on this data? And I'll actually kind of pause here and say, Matt, what's your reaction to this list and this delta we have here?
It's funny. We looked at this. So one of the teams that I have the privilege to lead at Palo Alto Networks is our Unit 42 cloud threat research team, right? And this is a team that literally all they do on a daily basis is go out and hunt for cloud threats across the cloud providers and Kubernetes and Docker, all of the kind of cloud native tooling. That's all this team does. And we produce our, twice a year, we produce a cloud threat report. Most recent one went out in February. We have another one coming out in the fall. And what we found was, as part of this whole move to cloud native, we know that organizations have just absolutely started to adopt, and DevOps teams have done this for years, but security teams are finally starting to look at how they can leverage infrastructure as code templates to really help put security into code. And so I bring that up because it was funny. So when we looked at some of our cloud threat research data, and then we looked at this specific top security concern, I was a little bit surprised because infrastructure misconfigurations showed up as only being, just about 9%, and data exposure was the top one. And it's interesting because we analyzed about 18 months worth of cloud breaches. And what we found was that about 65% of them, 65% were the result of customer misconfigurations, 65%. So it would seem that in this case, security professionals would be better served if they focused more on those infrastructure misconfigurations, because that would then likely lead to a lower rate of data exposure or data breach. So I thought that was pretty interesting, right? One thing we love this, we like to say is that, surveys are excellent indicators of what people think, right? Or what they intend to do. But threat research, on the other hand, it shows you what they actually put into practice. And so I think it's really valuable to have, things that you can quantify with threat research data, and then look at this side of it as well, because they are equally useful.
Well, and I think piggybacking off of what you just shared, your takeaway is that some of these things are very interrelated. You're not just trying to solve for a data exposure problem. Your data exposure may be elevated based on poorly configured infrastructure or an application vulnerability, for example.
Absolutely, absolutely. Most of these things that I look at this list, malware, application vulnerabilities, all of them are interrelated, like credential leakage, right? So if you don't have strong IAM governance, then all of these things, right? So if you have credentials that leak, well, that's obviously going to lead to data exposure. It's going to lead to an attacker getting into your infrastructure and probably purposefully creating misconfigurations that give them more access. So there is a lot of interplay between all of these items that we see here.
Yep. Awesome. Well, I'm going to keep pressing on as we, highlight more of our security takeaways. This is one that I've loved, talking back and forth about. As we look at, building on what we just talked about, we do have this notion of comprehensive cloud security. So how do organizations address multiple security concerns in a very comprehensive way? And as you can see, there's, again, not a large delta, and organizations have a lot of concerns. And so one of the top ones was lack of visibility into security vulnerabilities. So security practitioners and certainly application developers know that vulnerabilities create compromise. At the same time, employee training on security tools can be a challenge. And this, to me, maps to the technical complexity that organizations have talked about in moving to the cloud. And then finally, organizations can be challenged in evaluating their current state of security. And so obviously getting that baseline becomes really important. At the same time, one of the statistics that I was most surprised about in our report was that 73% of companies struggle to clearly delineate between the cloud service provider's security responsibilities and then the organization's security responsibilities. And so I included here, one of the simple graphics that we use to illustrate the cloud service provider shared responsibility model. And so the cloud service provider, they are responsible for securing their own data center, the switches, hubs, routers, and essentially the data storage that you would think of in an on-premise data center. But at the same time, organizations have a responsibility for the security of all of the things that they're building and running on the cloud service provider. So things like resource configurations, how you've configured user and credential rotation and access, how you've configured your cloud application networks is certainly paramount. Then you have what we call compute, the actual hosts, containers, and functions, essentially the application layer where you're building and deploying software. And then ultimately the data that you're storing on the cloud service provider, how you've configured that data storage and how you've configured access to it. And so this is something we're going to dive into in a couple of minutes when it comes to questions. But I think it's really indicative of the challenge organizations face, as almost 3 in 4 people, couldn't essentially map all of this out right away. And at the same time, as we think about this cloud, shared responsibility model, we asked organizations how many tools they're using, and do they feel that more tools means better security? And essentially, organizations said that wasn't true. So companies who have invested over 100 million in cloud ultimately are trimming the number of security tools that they use. And as Matt shared earlier, I think this comes to a maturity strategy, of which I'm sure he has some insights. And as we asked this group how many cloud security tools you're using, 53% said they're trying to get to 5 or fewer cloud security tools. And we added that organizations shared that they feel that more tools or vendors can create inefficiencies. Obviously, they highlighted the fact that training can become more difficult. So the more tools you have, the more processes and training you need to implement. And so essentially, as organizations mature and spend more in the cloud, they want to essentially consolidate and rationalize the tools and tool providers they have. And then this is a great jumping off point, for Matt to provide some insights. And I really want to start with the first question. Why do you feel organizations are so challenged in understanding the cloud shared responsibility model?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And, when I saw that data, that I think it was the 73%, I think that the real issue is not that organizations don't understand the difference between what they do and what the cloud service provider does. I really think it's an internal struggle in most organizations, and they're just not really clear as to what group is responsible for what in that shared responsibility model, right? So, I haven't spoken with a single company that actually said that wasn't aware of shared responsibility in the cloud. Where they really struggle, however, is putting it into practice, right? So, what I've seen is that because cloud is really, depending upon which model you're using, but generally speaking, in infrastructure and platform as a service, there's a lot to do. There's a heavy lift if you are a cloud consumer. And I think early on, many organizations kind of went in with the assumption like, hey, cloud service provider, they're doing everything for me, security included. Well, many organizations now know that's not the case at all, right? A lot of organizations assume that, hey, if I move to cloud, I'm going to get automation. Not true. You've got to build it, right? So you can do it. They've got the APIs. But I think what I have actually seen help organizations get clarity specifically around the shared responsibility is by creating a RACI, right? So all it is a simple chart that shows who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed. And I did a blog on this a couple weeks ago, where I actually laid out a sample RACI for the shared responsibility model. And depending upon the size of the organization, it could take a couple weeks, couple months to figure out. But I think once organizations actually get clear and get it documented who's responsible for what, that's when this whole notion of who does what really goes away.
I think that's really impactful. I also think, I'm not going to ask you question 2 again, since we talked about that so much when I had the slide up.
Yeah.
But piggybacking off of what you just shared, what are some of the top security concerns you see for organizations as they adopt, more security tooling? And I'm guessing that it's not just about the tools themselves, it's also about those processes, training, and implementation that you also just highlighted.
Yeah. I mean, we love to talk about, people, process, and technology when it comes to security. But unfortunately, as security professionals, we love to focus on the technology part and we forget about the people in the process. That's why I believe so many organizations have just this massive security tool sprawl. I did a talk at RSA about a year ago. It was called 99 Security Tools and You Still Got Breached. And it was just this whole talk focusing on the fact that security teams have really become product security support teams, right? They've got, we did an informal survey of the audience and we found that, if you're a small business, you might have about 20 different security tools. And this is on-prem and in the cloud, right? Medium-sized companies could have up to 60 security tools. And then some of the largest, like think of like a financial services company, they could have over 120 different security tools. And so, when let's just say you're right in the middle there. Let's say you've got 60 security tools you're trying to manage. Again, you spend more time trying to figure out how to make sense of all the different data and all the different signals that's coming out of all these different security tools. And your team, if you're a CISO, they're not actually holistically focused on managing risk in the environment, which is supposed to be the chief focus, right, of a security team. So, I haven't spoken with a single CISO over the last, I'd say 2 years, who hasn't told me that they're overloaded with tools and that they're looking to downsize. And so I know a lot of organizations in the last year, as they're moving, last 2 years or so, as they're moving to the cloud, they've actually done a tools rationalization. They've said, hey, we've got dozens of tools on premise. we don't want to replicate that when we go to the cloud, right? How do we find comprehensive platforms that, don't require tool sprawl? And, what's interesting is that when an organization has dozens of tools, there's actually a hidden cost. And I talked about this in my RSA presentation, right? So you've got your upfront cost to actually buy the product or tool. And then you've got to buy someone to manage the tool, right? So this is the people side of it. And then you need someone to make sense of all the intelligence coming out of the tool. And then fourth, you have to buy someone to bring it all together, to tie it all together. And usually this falls on the SOC team, right? The Security Operations Center. And it's only when you add up all four of those that you actually get to the actual total cost of ownership of an individual security tool. So I think all of these types of things, as companies are moving to the cloud, are really driving that focus to how do I bring down the number of tools? And I thought this was a great confirmation that we saw in our data when we said, look, the companies that are truly serious about cloud, right? Spending 100 million or more. And it doesn't matter if you're a really large company or a medium-sized company, $100 million spend on cloud, it's significant, right? Those that are serious, they've actually started to reduce the number of tools. So I think this makes sense. And I think as companies mature, this is where they are going to eventually get to.
Great. And I want to build on this notion of maturity as we dive into the last section of the report here, because these are some of the statistics that I think you're going to have a lot of takeaways for our audience on. And so one of the metrics that we built coming out of our report was this notion of measuring security preparedness. And so when we talk about cloud security preparedness, we asked our respondents we gathered answers to questions about 19 specific security practices. And if you dive into our 60-page report, you can dive deeper into more of these specific practices. And what I thought was really surprising was less than 20% self-declared that they were highly prepared to keep their cloud estates secure. So barely 1 in 5 kind of put themselves in the highly prepared category. And what I was really concerned about is that almost 1 in 3 self-declared that they felt they were in the lowest prepared category when it came to securing their cloud environments. And obviously we can start to stitch together some different data points that we've talked about today. But it's obviously, a challenge when organizations say we're struggling or we need to improve. And as we dived earlier though, I want to learn a little bit more about what the organizations who said they were highly prepared, what did they feel like they were doing right? And so one of the things that we've highlighted a little bit, which we're going to talk about in more detail, is embedding security controls across the application lifecycle. And highly prepared organizations said this greatly improved their security. And so 45% of those highly prepared companies embedded security into the DevOps process. And so they said this is one of the reasons that they felt like they were improving their overall security posture. And then as companies improved their security preparedness, they stated that using a single comprehensive cloud security solution could improve their outcomes. And so as we just discussed, 50% of the highly prepared companies were actively reducing or rationalizing the number of security tools they had. And then 51% agreed that if they could use more of a single end-to-end security solution, that would improve their overall cloud security posture. And obviously there's a lot of reasons for this, but this is essentially what the highly prepared group was moving toward. And this sets up some really good questions. I think first I want to talk about preparedness as a whole. Matt, were you surprised to see that number of lowest prepared respondents kind of like score themselves in that way?
No, I wasn't really surprised by that. What I found most interesting though is that was not necessarily that a third of them said they weren't well prepared, but as we spoke of a few minutes ago, that they're actually focused on some of the wrong things when it comes to, if you remember, what they were most concerned with around security. And this is interesting, right? Because when we look at kind of psychology and how the human brain works, this is a classic case in my view of confirmation bias. So you'll often hear about that talked about when it comes to things like investing, but it applies to security as well, right? So people often seek out others who have made or are still making the same mistakes, and they continue to do those things. So I think this is why, if someone is developing a cloud security strategy, this is why it's so important that that strategy be informed by both survey data, such as what we're going through now, as well as cloud threat research data. So I think on one hand, it's good that from the perspective of, if someone says, look, I'm low prepared, that means they have a willingness to, they realize that they have a long way to go and that they have work to do. And, we'll get into a little bit more around, I think, just, low versus high, and what are some of those reasons that, our methodology would have indicated one way versus another. But I think, again, this is just really why it's so important that people take a data-driven approach when they're building out their cloud security strategy.
And as you work with security leaders, what are some of the most common recommendations that you make to organizations, focused on improving this cloud security preparedness metric?
So for me, as you can tell by now, right, for me, I'm a huge strategy person. I think all too often as security professionals, we're very reactionary, we're very defensive, and we go immediately to tactics, right? So I think, if an organization finds themselves in this low preparedness category, that the first thing to do is kind of step back and ask themselves, do they have a strategy for cloud security? Because I can guarantee you that the CIO has a cloud adoption strategy, right? So they need to make sure that they're creating a cloud security strategy that matches that. And so I did a blog probably about a year ago where I laid out 5 key steps or 5 key areas of focus that should be part of any cloud security strategy. And we called it the Big Cloud 5. You can Google that and probably be top result, but real quickly, right? So number 1 is getting visibility, understanding what your cloud estate looks like today. That gives you situational awareness, right? And then maintaining that over time. The second step is about setting guardrails. And this is, you can think about these as, maybe your dirty dozen, right? Here are the things or the misconfigurations or the anti-patterns that we never want to see happen in our cloud environment. Like, for example, maybe a public cloud storage bucket, right? Something as simple as that. That's what I mean by setting like those proactive guardrails, that if I see this configuration in my environment, I'm automatically going to set it back to the correct configuration. The third one is about adopting standards. We talked a little bit earlier around why that's so important to stay ahead of the risk curve. The fourth has to do with the people side, right? Training and hiring security engineers who know how to code. We'll get a little bit more into that, I think, in a few minutes. And then the last one is just about embedding security into development process. In many organizations, there's still a huge divergence between security and DevOps. The two of them are complete silos. And so that step of first having people on the security team that understand code movement, how to automate security tools, you need that before you can really get to a point of high preparedness where you're embedding security organically into the development lifecycle.
And that really brings us to our last, question here. As development teams and DevOps, play such a big role in cloud application security, why is integrating, pipeline security so important for security teams as organizations adopt these cloud native architectures?
Yeah, I dug into this a little bit because I was trying to understand just, we've talked about shift left as a security industry for probably 5-7 years now. And, we just know that many organizations are still not quite there, right? Again, those that identified as low prepared would probably be those organizations that have not done anything to integrate security into their development pipeline. And so I looked up some other ancillary data. And what I found was that, so looking at ISC squared, right, some of their data, they found that there's about 2.8 million cybersecurity professionals worldwide. All right, so you have 2.8 million cybersecurity professionals over here. And then I went out and I looked at what the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or the CNCF, found. So they said there's about 4.7 million cloud native developers worldwide. So when you look at it, we have a numbers problem, right? 2.8 million security professionals, 4.7 million cloud native developers. You can't fix that problem by continually just trying to say, I need to hire more security engineers, or I need more security architects. We're looking at almost double in terms of the amount of developers. And so this really requires advanced planning and an intimate relationship between security and DevOps. So again, we've talked about this move to cloud native and to shift left for years, but now with the massive move fueled by containers and serverless to cloud native architectures, this is an imperative, right? So I think there's a lot of good parallels in the manufacturing world. In the manufacturing world, there's a huge focus on quality. The pipeline, or the software development pipeline, needs to be thought of the same way. A quality-focused pipeline produces applications with very low defects, both in terms of bugs that may anger an end user, might change their user experience to be something negative, as well as security defects. So I think this is a mindset that we really need to have organizations focus more on. And the only way you can do that is with security that's integrated into the development pipeline.
And I think that provides a great point for us closing up today's presentation, where I just want to take 90 seconds to highlight how Prisma Cloud can help organizations achieve some of these outcomes. And so Prisma Cloud provides comprehensive cloud native security integrated across the application lifecycle. And we ultimately group our capabilities into these 4 key pillars. As Matt highlighted today, being able to implement visibility, compliance, and governance over both single and multi-cloud environments helps you understand your cloud security posture, achieve compliance, and obviously enforce guardrails over all of your resources and configurations. With compute security, we want to provide both vulnerability management, compliance, and runtime protection for any of the stacks you might be using across hosts, containers, and functions. Network protection provides you with monitoring and secure networking, being able to enforce microsegmentation, as well as gain visibility from flow log analysis. And then finally, with identity security, we want to help organizations enforce least permission access control across their workloads and clouds. And obviously, this becomes achievable when we can integrate these capabilities across build, deploy, and run. So combining vulnerability scanning and infrastructure as code scanning, whether you want to embed this as part of your IDE, SCM, or CI process, we can provide these security checks as part of your continuous delivery workflows, as well as being able to continuously scan and enforce controls across your container registries or serverless repositories, with the notion of being able to actually prevent insecure deployments. And then finally, we want to combine this visibility, governance, and runtime protection across your entire stack, whether you're running on some of the major cloud service providers or hybrid cloud or private cloud environments. I want to close today by thanking Matt for joining us today and providing so many great insights. It was thrilled that we were able to have today's conversation. So thank you so much, Matt, for guiding us through today's convo.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Keith. You did a great job walking us through the data. And I really think that if people, again, use this data to create and inform their cloud strategy, by the next time we do this report, we'll hopefully have a lot more people in that highly prepared category.
That sounds great. And I want to thank our audience and our on-demand viewers for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be glad to share our full 60-page cloud native security report with everyone, as well as other takeaways from Palo Alto Networks. Thank you so much for joining today.
All right, everybody. I did note at the top of the webinar that we would not be doing a question and answer period. However, if you do have a question for either Keith or Matt or anybody over at Palo Alto Network, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question now. They will be getting a copy of all of the questions that come over, so I'm sure they will be more than happy to follow up with you offline. I also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you miss any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the Security Boulevard website. So you can always go find it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And while you're there, please go ahead and take a look at some of the other webinars that we have, both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be something there that piques your interest. I want to thank Keith Mokris and Matt Chiodi for a great presentation today. And I'd like to thank the audience also for joining me. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.